G'day again guys, and thank you for joining me. I must say, it feels like forever since I have sat down to talk to you guys. This drawing just proved to be an incredibly challenging piece, and it took me so much longer than I thought it would to complete. Now, I recorded this drawing over multiple sessions, so I'm going to be editing this one a little bit differently than usual, just so I don't make you guys seasick. I hope you like it. Now, my goal for this piece was to make this drawing as realistic as possible, but I was making things a little bit extra challenging for myself by choosing a less than amazing reference photo. Now, I've had this photo in my to draw folder for a very long time. One day, I walked outside my house to find a flock of wild cockatoos had completely overtaken the bushes across the road from my house. And these cockies were going absolutely nuts, shredding up the fruit and tearing up the plant and just generally having a wonderful time. But it was a rainy day and I did feel a little bit silly standing in the middle of the road taking pictures of a bush in front of all of my neighbours. So I just set my camera to auto, ran outside and took a couple of really quick photos and ran back inside the house. When I checked, the resulting photos had some really interesting poses, but not a single shot was completely in focus. That was really disappointing. But every time I check my reference pictures, I find myself wanting to give these pictures a go, so I decided it was finally time to bite the bullet and see what I could do with these images. Looking at these slightly out of focus photos, I was really inspired to get some different areas of focus across this piece. I wanted a very soft blended background, a very slightly more in focus midground, and then I wanted to build up to some really sharp detail in the foreground. I knew this was going to be really difficult for me because I haven't really drawn foliage like this before, especially in very high detail. So I decided that I would force myself to really slow down on this piece and approach each area with as much care and attention as I could muster. I usually like to work on the background or the subject individually, starting with one or the other and then moving on to the next, but I couldn't do that in this particular case. I was working on a sheet of light grey Pastelmat, which is a wonderful surface for colour pencil, but it does kick up so much pencil dust, and it really does get all over the surface as you work. I was using some very dark greens and blues on that background, and I really didn't want that dust to contaminate the area where the white colour of the bird needed to go. So I needed to work from the top down in a way where my right hand wouldn't completely smudge that pencil all over the page as I worked. At many points I did have a piece of wax paper underneath my hand to help prevent some of that smudging as much as possible, but really just keeping my hand completely out of the way and avoiding those areas was much more reliable. In many cases, as I worked on this piece, I did turn the piece of paper so that my hand would be free from that area. And unfortunately, I did have to cut many of those occasions out of this time lapse, so I don't make you guys too dizzy. Working on these leaves was a completely new experience for me, and I really did have to take it one leaf at a time. That tangled mass of leaves was really hard to get my head around, but I knew I needed to take the time to get it right, or I would lose all of the detail that I wanted to get. I spent a lot of time looking at each leaf and stem, studying its shape, and trying to understand where it attached and what direction it was falling in. I could not believe how many colours I could see in each of these leaves. Now, from a distance, each leaf just looked green, but on this closer inspection, I found shades of reds and ochres and blues and purples, which really blew me away. This detail was really fun to find, but it was also very tiring, and I found that I had to take very regular breaks from this piece to prevent me from rushing or starting to get lazy with the piece. With the top and the left-hand side of the piece complete, I moved on to the bird himself, and here I needed a little bit of extra help. In my reference photo, the cockatoo's head is one of the areas that's in the worst focus. I can see a lot of the landmarks, but any details are completely fuzzed out, so I turned to my own model to fill in the details. Those of you who have been watching my channel for long would have seen artwork featuring my own cockatoo named Woody before, and I needed to get his help again. I grabbed my phone and I started taking photos. What I really wanted to do was to get a similar pose to the cockatoo in my picture, but this was easier said than done. Now, Woody's quite used to me being in the cage with him, but he's definitely not so sure about that phone. So it took a good few minutes of crest raising and posing, and even a few attempts at chewing my phone out of my hand, before he relaxed enough to allow me to grab a few good close-ups of his face. Now, the lighting in my photo was of course completely different for the reference image, but I was able to fill in a lot of the details around the eyes and the directions of the feathers from these shots, and it helped a great deal. With the face complete, I started to move on down his body. Now, cockatoos have this really soft sort of white feather texture. They sit really closely together and there really isn't a lot of detail to add here, except for maybe a few shadows. Now, I could have drawn in individual feathers here, but adding detail for the sake of detail in this case really would have lost that really lovely white, softly textured plumage. So I added in a few base layers of colour, mostly greys and blues, to show the dimensions of his body, and then I used my white pencil over the top of this to bring it all together. Despite my best efforts earlier, some of that green pencil dust of the background was still staining this area, but that small amount actually did a wonderful job of making it look like some of those greens of the leaves were reflecting on his pure white feathers. Colouring this area chewed up a lot of my white pencil, and I was starting to think I was going to have to make an emergency run to the art shop to finish this one off. But thankfully that white pencil held up, and when I was finished with his body, I was so pleased with the way those white feathers stood out from that background. In many ways, it was that starkness of the white birds up against the darkness of the trees that had drawn me to take that reference photo in the first place. And with that bird in place, I could finally see this piece coming together. But now I had to go back to drawing the leaves. Oh no, more leaves. I started off with an area of soft focus, which felt a little bit uncomfortable after adding so much detail around the rest of the piece. The softest parts of this background was the only place where I used odorless mineral spirits to blend out on this entire drawing. And blurring this area out so much after such precise work earlier felt like I was creating a muddy mess. But I kept going, hoping it would add some really good depth to the final piece. Now I was onto the final straight. I knew what I had to do, I just had to take my time and not rush to finish. It was so tempting at this point to just try and get it done, but I knew that a rush would show in the final image. So I took my time, completing 2 or 3 leaves and then stepping away from the table. Each leaf and stem at this point had to have the same amount of care and attention to all of the other leaves before it, and I couldn't get cocky and assume that I knew what I saw or that I had already figured out how to do this, just because the finish line was so close. This final area took days to complete, because every time I felt myself getting impatient or sloppy with my work, I forced myself away from the piece, and it was so frustrating. But I got there in the end, and as those final berries were put into place, I was really pleased with what I saw. So here's the final piece, and I love it. As always, there are things that I would change or do differently. I'm never 100% happy, but I am really, really proud of this piece, and I'm so glad I took a chance on that dodgy photo. Now, if you like this one too, prints of this piece will be available over on my Etsy store now, and I'm going to take a bit of a risk this time and enter the original into an art show. Now, no matter the result of that, I'm really, really happy to finally have a piece that I think is worth entering, so wish me luck. I would just like to take a moment to thank my patrons. Now, I will be uploading a couple of 1-hour real-time videos of this piece over the next week. It's not quite up yet because I have been working on another project, part 1 of which is already available to my $5 patrons now. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please leave me a like or a comment to tell me what you think. And if you're new here and you'd like to see some more of my work, then why not hit that subscribe button? Thanks for watching, guys.